first time. All right, thank you all so much for being here at Prologue tonight. We're great people, and I'm glad to be in this hall. We're going to do this out in the lobby because we were kind of enjoying using the lobby, but so many people signed up. We had to be here, which is terrific. So thank you all for being here. My name is Kevin Landis. I'm the director of the Theater and Dance program here at UCCS and the producer of the Prologue series. I don't know what to say for introduction, so I'm not going to say much because I put a long bio of our guests here that I know you all have read very closely. It is such an honor to have this person. When I first came to UCCS about 10 years ago, one of the first things I saw, and all credit to our colleagues over at Colorado College, was an extraordinary talk with David Henry Hwang, and now I'm blanking, who else was there? Tony Kirshner and Susan Boyd-Parse. And I thought, we have to write Tony with all of them. But we have to bring David at some point. And I had the great opportunity to have an interview with him for some work that I'm doing back in New York. And I said, no, I want to come back. He said, yeah, sure. So we scheduled it. And thank you all for being here. David Henry Hwang wrote so many wonderful plays. He's continuing to write plays. I had the great privilege of seeing his most recent one this weekend in New York. A musical called Soft Power, which we'll talk about tonight. He co-wrote with the musician and songwriter James Sword, who was also here for Prologue. So I just feel so awesome because Prologue is so cutting edge. Everything that's happening in American theater right now. We feel very, very about that. I'm not going to say anything more about him. You know him, and it is just my deep honor and privilege to present to you David Henry Hwang. Thank you for being here. I'm a wee bit sheepish to say I had all of these questions that I was working on all weekend long to ask you, and then I printed out the wrong page, and so I have a blank page here. But what has been this is not going to be hard. What has been wonderful just in the last few hours, we've had a chance to talk a little bit about your career, and we have so much to talk about tonight. So first of all, thank you for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's great to come back to one of the most beautiful places in America, so why not?
It's not bad, right? Yeah, great. I gotta say, I want to talk a little bit about your career and how you got into playwriting, but I want to start a little bit early, a little bit past the beginning, and then talk a little bit in Butterfly. I'm doing this totally selfishly. It changed my life as a theater person. And interestingly, and I think I told you this afternoon, the first musical I ever saw was Miss Saigon. The first great play I ever saw was in Butterfly. And those are two important plays to be someone who works for someone, and because they were so intricately tied. Would you tell us a little bit about In Butterfly and what that meant to your career? It was such a huge watershed moment for you, and it continues to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think to this day it's probably the work that I'm still best known for. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's based on the true story of a French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress who turned out to be A, a spy, but B, what we would now call biologically male, and the diplomat claimed that he never knew the gender of his lover. And so I heard that at a cocktail party, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And then the idea of, I thought about it for about a year, and at one point I asked myself, well, what did the diplomat think that he found? And the answer came to me, oh, he probably thought he'd found his version of Madame Butterfly. And at that point, the idea of dovetailing the events of the spy story and the plot of Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly felt to me like a really interesting and robust way to get at that story. And it's just, we opened in Washington, D.C., and got bad reviews, and we're hemorrhaging money, and one of our producers, David Geffen, tried to close the show, and so the other producer, Stuart Ostro, mortgaged his house to get us to New York, and we limped in, and it's one of those very dramatic Broadway stories, which happily had a good ending. But yeah, I mean, it ran for 2 years on Broadway, basically, which is pretty hard for a play to do nowadays. I mean, you could do it then. And I think more importantly, it introduces in a sort of political aesthetic sense this notion of what it means to deconstruct, to reinterpret a classic work that a particular author, i.e. me, finds problematic. And it also, I think, brought an Asian or Asian American lens to some of these tropes that have existed in the culture, which certainly hadn't been seen on a Broadway level up to that point.
I want to come back to the Butterfly and then move through some of the other major works in your career, including Soft Power, which is in New York right now. But I want to start kind of from the beginning. How did you get interested in playwriting? What were some of those essential first moments in the theater for you?
Yeah, so I feel like there's two kind of formative things that happened when I was a kid. Because I didn't grow up in a theater family per se, but I grew up in a musical family. My mom was a pianist, I was a violinist, my sister was and is now a professional cellist. So I grew up with a lot of music, and when I was about 10 years old, my mom was the rehearsal pianist for a company called East West Players in Los Angeles, which is the nation's oldest Asian American theater and now the nation's oldest ethnic theater. And so she was at rehearsals, and I could either have gone to rehearsals or gotten babysat by my aunt, and I decided to go to rehearsals. And I feel like probably in retrospect it's significant that at that early age I saw people who looked like me as theater people, as artistic leaders, as directors and actors. The second thing was also right around that age. My maternal grandmother fell ill, and we all thought that she was going to pass away. And I was one of these kids who just was always interested in family history, and she was the family historian. So I thought if she died, there would be this double loss. Of course, we'd lose my grandmother, but we would also lose these stories. So I asked my parents if I could spend the summer with her. She was living in the Philippines. I was born and raised in LA. And I went over and took what we would now call oral histories. I got all of her stories on cassette tapes, then I came back and compiled them into sort of a 90-page nonfiction novel about the history of my family, which got Xerox, got distributed to my relatives, got really good reviews. And again, in retrospect, I guess what I was trying to do, even at that age, was try to contextualize my own existence, to try to understand who I am, or understand my identity within a larger sort of socio-historical context. So those are really that was the only theatrical experience I had as a kid, and then the only writing experience until I got to college, and I saw some plays, and I thought, I can probably do that. So I started writing plays in my spare time. I found a professor who was willing to take a look at them. He told me they were really bad, which they were, but he was a good guy and helped me design a playwriting major at Stanford, which didn't have one. And senior year, I got the play to be done in my dorm, which 14 months later opened at the Public Theater, where I'm working now. And I started having a career.
So seniors, so yeah. 14 months. No, I mean, that's an extraordinary story, and that it happened. It's pretty freaky, right? Yeah. But you told me before, when we talked in the spring, a little bit about how that wended its way to New York. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so how does a play go from a dorm to, public theater? So two things. Number one, I think it exemplifies the dynamic relationship between art and community activism. Because around the time that I was doing the play in my dorm, the public had done a play by Len Jenkins called New Jerusalem, in which a Caucasian actor was cast in an Asian role. And this led to probably the first yellow-face protests in New York theater history. We know what blackface is, and yellow-face is the equivalent for Asians. And the Asian actors of that day went and protested outside the Public Theater. And Joe Pack, the founder of the Public, arguably the greatest American theatrical producer of the last half of the 20th century, who created The Public and Shakespeare in the Park, and produced everything from Chorus Line to Hair to sort of most of the major American playwrights. So Joe's mission that he set for himself was to sort of create a theater which looked like New York. And so when these protests happened, Joe invited the protesters into his office and ended up hiring one of them onto his staff with a brief defined plays for Asian actors. And it was just about that time that my play came across their desk. So I always consider myself the beneficiary of affirmative action, because that's really what affirmative action does. It identifies a social need and then creates a program to try to address that. And the door was open for a little, and I was glad to have the well through.
And tell us about that play. What was it, and what was the general background?
Right, so it's called FOB. It's not the TV show, although the TV show is perfectly fine. And it also stands for Fresh Off the Boat. And it's basically a triangle between an ABC, an American-born Chinese, an FOB, someone who's fresh off the boat, and a woman who was born in Taiwan but then came to the States at an early age, and was really kind of examining tensions between these different groups, and particularly the tendency of the American-born Chinese like myself to assimilate, and as part of that assimilation to look down on or have contempt for those who were foreign born. But it examines it within the context of there's these sort of Chinese mythological characters that come up, and there's this sort of Chinese Americans from history, that there's this sort of transformation that happens in these characters. And actually, just about 4 hours ago, an article came online in the New York Times that's about, where they interviewed a number of playwrights about our first play. And so I talk about FOB in that. And it's amazing to me that, 40 years later, the show still gets done. I mean, there's references to John Travolta and the Bee Gees, and stuff that cars that Fiat X19 that I don't think anyone knows anymore. But it's nice that it still gets done.
I want to talk and sort of fast forward a little bit and come back a little bit to Madame Butterfly. In Butterfly, as I said, as I was reading your bio, someone has written you are one of the most prolific opera librettists alive today. You have always had this real affinity for opera and theater and the blending of the two, and obviously in Butterfly being based on Madame Butterfly, that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about your work in opera and why you see these two forms as so essential to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been interested in, even when I was in college, this idea that this notion in the 70s was called theatricalism. So the notion that you try to utilize and exploit those things and techniques that theater does better than other mediums. So that involves like live music. Live music is usually more exciting and affecting than recorded music. Dance is better to see live than on a video screen. And just trying to use the tools of theater. And certainly, because I grew up in a musical family, I feel comfortable around music. I can't write music, but I can read music, and I think I have a sense for it. I was a jazz musician for many years. So there's a relationship, I believe, between improvisation and the process of writing. And then the reason I like theater is because, I do work in film and television and all those, but theater is probably closest to my heart because there's something about theater that is inherently metaphorical. So if even if you're seeing like a really naturalistic kitchen sink drama, you know that's not really a kitchen. As opposed to the way this filmmaking works in America, we tend to make everything be very realistic and have a sense of being a fly on the wall. So even in Star Wars, it's like really happening. And the metaphorical level of theater is interesting to me because it means that you can both see what's going on, you see the story that's taking place, but you're also able to distance yourself a little from it and understand other things about the story, like the context or the history, in a way that I think is different from film and television. So opera is that much more metaphorical. It's that much more unreal. It's that much more theatrical. Because in real life, people don't sing all the time. So that automatically means that the audience has a level of suspension of disbelief when they come to the theater that's different than they bring to a naturalistic play or certainly film and television.
Well, and there's obviously a magic to your work. What started drawing you, and this is a way to talk about In Butterfly, but also Soft Power. What drew you to some of these classic works that maybe needed a little revising or re-looking at, and then thinking about In Butterfly, but also with your current work, that's King and I, and Rogers and Emerson?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, if I knew that there was going to be a movie or a TV show with Asian characters, I would go out of my way not to watch it. Because some part of me just intuitively knew it would make me feel bad. Because when I was a kid, the representations of Asian characters were inhuman. They were inhumanly bad, like they were villains, or they were evil Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, or Chinese soldiers, or they were just oversized women, or they were jokes a lot of times. The Asians were sort of the butts of jokes. Or they could be inhumanly good, like Charlie Chan, which is a lot of people don't know who Charlie Chan is anymore, which I think is kind of great. But he was a detective. But he spoke in these sort of fortune-picking aphorisms, and of course he was always played by a white guy. So he didn't really seem like a human being. And so I think I've come to realize, particularly working on Soft Power, that I didn't experience a lot of overt racism as a kid. I mean, a lot of microaggressions, but no overt racism. But I think I felt oppressed by American popular culture, American culture and popular culture. And so much of my adult life has been about trying to gain access to the leaders of that culture and then re-examine some of these stories from my point of view. And that applies to certainly In Butterfly and Soft Power and many other tropes that show up in my work where I'm trying to deconstruct the stuff that made me feel bad as a kid.
One of the most, at least for me, the most interesting stories in your career is what happened with In Butterfly and Miss Saigon, and then your response to it in Yellowface. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. I suppose it's well to platform that one of the major controversies about Miss Saigon was that Jonathan Pryce, a Caucasian actor, played the Asian-identified engineer. I shouldn't say it's just accepted, because there was a lot of controversy, but he went on and won the Tony Award. That was influential and in some ways led to some of the work that you did after, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, my career was started, as I was saying earlier, by a Yellowface protest. And so 10 years later, after In Butterfly had happened and I was quite visible, the idea that another sort of major Yellowface show was coming into New York, I guess I felt like I needed to sort of pay it, or I was paid forward or something. Anyway, I needed to sort of take that responsibility and be part of that Yellowface protest. And it was kind of an early culture wars conflict. I would say 90% of the New York and American cultural community was against those of us who were complaining about Jonathan Pryce, and felt it was an example of political correctness run amok. And we didn't succeed in the sense that Pryce did play the part on Broadway, and played very well. I mean, there's no question about that he's a good actor, and won the Tony. But I felt that it was important because Cameron McIntosh was the producer of Miss Saigon. After the thing was over, the controversy was more or less over, and it seemed that Pryce was going to play the role on Broadway. Cameron McIntosh said that all future engineers would be tasked with Asian actors, and he's been true to that. So that Miss Saigon ended up providing a lot of employment for Asian actors, and I still have some issues with the story, but that's kind of another question. So you gain the kind of victories that you can, and fight the battles that you can.
Say a little bit for those maybe who haven't seen Yellowface, although there was a production done here a couple of years ago, which I want to talk about as well. But could you say a little bit about how you confronted it through that script?
Yeah, so the Miss Saigon controversy was, as I said, pretty volatile, and it was in a pre-internet, pre-Twitter age. So there was sort of the equivalent of getting shamed, but more in the mainstream media than in social media. And the kind of level of anger that I experienced kind of directed towards us made me think, oh, it's, how is this country going to move forward? And I struggled with that question for about 14 years. So I wrote a play that was a response to Miss Saigon, the Miss Saigon controversy, called Face Value. And I thought, okay, I'm going to make a comedy of mistaken racial identity, because there's lots of comedies of mistaken sexual identity, like the sort of British sex farce is essentially based on one of the big tropes is, somebody dresses up as the other gender and then actually gets mistaken for the other gender, and and I thought, maybe we should do like a comedy of mistaken racial identity, because we can examine what does race mean, and is it a construct, and this whole notion of playing another race, or do we play our own races? But I wrote this kind of Feydeau-like door slamming farce, more like Noise Is Off, or some of the people like Joe Orton plays. And those are really hard to write. I guess it wasn't good enough to do it, honestly. But it was right after I'm Butterfly, so it was like, we're just going to take it straight to Broadway. And we opened in Boston, and the headline on the main review was M. Turkey. Which is funny now. And then we got Broadway and closed in preview, so it was a huge disaster. But I kept thinking about this idea, how do you mistake racial identity? And then eventually that led to the play Yellowface, where I essentially wrote a comedy of mistaken racial identity, but with a different form. Instead of using the farce form, I used a kind of stage mockumentary form. So I was riffing off of Moises Kaufman or Anna Fear Smith, but doing a mockumentary version instead of a documentary version.
Yeah. So I did want to bring it sort of regional as well. As I mentioned to you, there was a production a couple of years ago of Yellowface at Colorado College.
Thank you.
And I think the irony, if I could put it that way, or the controversy that arose out of it, was at the same time an opera company in town was doing Mikado. And so the juxtaposition of those two pieces of work, quite literally next door to each other, was a reason for conversation. And I wonder if, without knowing about how all that played out here, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of, especially in opera, like Mikado or Madame Butterfly, or The King and I, even. I'm fumbling at this question, but I'm going to the question that you were asked in Time magazine recently, are these plays that we should retire, or how do we approach them? I think the juxtaposition of those two plays right next to each other sort of crystallized that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that we should just sort of ban anything. I know that there is a point of view that we should say, well, certain works just shouldn't be done. I'm not really of that mind. I think that the important thing is two things. Number one, understand the problematic aspects of the work, so that you, at the same time, that you may be admiring the craft of the work, but you're also understanding, well, what is the message that this craft is delivering? What is the Ginny Sawyer uses the term delivery system, that musicals are a delivery system, and they kind of go straight to our hearts. So what is the underlying message? So, for instance, in King and I, I've always loved the King and I, and I saw the most recent production, the Bart Sher production, which is a gorgeous production. Like for the first time, I was aware that there are some things that are pretty problematic about the story, such as the premise. There's like this white woman teaches the King of Siam how to, rule his own country, bring it into the family of nations. It is unlikely that actually happened, and in fact, historically, it did not happen. I mean, Anna Lawrence was there, but she didn't teach the king how to keep Siam free from colonialism. But, there's something in the power of the show, so that by the end of it, the king is dying, and his son is taking over, and I'm crying. So it's this very complicated feeling that I think we experience in a lot of works that come from an earlier time and have a perspective that doesn't largely jive with a modern sensibility. That feeling that, well, I don't really like some of this content, but it's so well done. And I think that's an interesting tension. So the ability to both understand what the work is doing on a craft level, but also being able to critique the themes that are, and some of the underlying socio-political messages, I think is a good tension. The second thing is simply to try to address it, maybe artistically, if you're an artist, if this is something which is really bothering you, to find a way to respond to it creatively. Also, I believe, and if you're not an artist, or this is an artist also, but I believe that the producer has the right to produce anything they want, but people who don't like it have the right to complain and protest as loudly as they want. And for me, that's the best way to balance people's civil liberties in a free society.
I'd be remiss not to sort of transition into a conversation about soft power a little bit, because it's related to all of those things that you were just saying. Presuming, since it really just opened, that most people haven't seen it, is there a way you could tell us a little bit about what it's about so we could engage a little bit in some of those ideas?
So Soft Power is a play that becomes a musical. So the first 15 minutes is a comedy that takes place in 2016, where a Chinese executive comes to America and has a glancing relationship with an American leader, i.e. Hillary Clinton. And then the show jumps 100 years into the future, and what we're watching is a musical from China's point of view that mythologizes the events that we saw at the beginning. And from China's point of view, it's a musical about how China stepped in to lead the world when America collapsed after the 2016 election. That's basically what it is.
And Act 2 starts with a panel of experts and a pompous professor, and I sat there like, oh my god, this is prologue. So let's talk about it.
That's very sympathetic.
Oh, great, thank you. I was perhaps reading too far. So given that context, talk about the things that I mean, it's pretty clear what you're challenging relative to identity with King and I and representation. What was the development of using Hillary Clinton and using that whole milieu as the focus?
Well, I initially thought that there was an early version of the script where the Chinese guy comes to America and in the musical teaches President Hillary Clinton how to solve the problem of gun violence in America. So we did a reading of that version on Election Day in 2016. And the next morning I woke up and thought, okay, I think this is going to be bad for the country, but I think it could be really good for the musical. Because the show, which initially I thought was going to examine this notion of can China gain soft power? So I should define soft power. Soft power is a term by the Harvard political scientist Joseph Nye that he coined about 20 years ago that represents a nation's sort of cultural and narrative attractiveness. So you have hard power, which is a nation's financial power or military. And then soft power is its intellectual and cultural capital, its ability to tell a narrative, a story about itself that the rest of the world finds attractive, so the rest of the world wants to be on your team. So China has had the stated goal to gain soft power ever since Hu Jintao, I think in 2010, stated it as something China needed to get. But China really hasn't done that well at gaining soft power. So the show was originally going to be about, can China gain soft power, like have hit international movies and shows that end up on our Broadway and everything, under an authoritarian system of censorship. But because of this whole 2016 election thing, the show now ends up being about how has America lost soft power and can we gain it back? Which I think is actually a more interesting subject for an American audience. So that happened, and then the other thing that changed the trajectory of the show was I got stabbed in the neck just in a random incident on my block. It was like 9 o'clock a few years ago, and I was carrying some groceries, and I just thought someone hit me on the back of the head. And I was like, what the F? And I turned and I thought I saw someone running away. And I figured I wasn't going to chase after him. So I would just keep walking home, but I couldn't walk straight. And I thought maybe I had a concussion. And then I put my hand up to where I'd been hit and it came away covered with blood. And then I realized I'd been stabbed. And I remember from Boy Scouts, you're supposed to put pressure on a wound. So I did that. And then I could walk straight. And actually, this part isn't in the show, but the real story, I actually dropped the groceries off at home. Like, we lived 2 blocks away from a hospital, so I was like, okay, just need to get the ER. But my home was on the way, so I dropped off the groceries. And my wife and daughter were there, and I was like, I can use some help, I think I've been attacked, but then I thought, I should just keep walking. So I did, and then they caught up with me and got to the hospital. And I said, I think I'm going to faint now, and I did. And then I guess I went into convulsions, and it turns out that the attacker suffered my vertebral artery. So I lost about a third of my blood, and I could have bled out, but I probably should have gotten a stroke, just because the incision's up here, and so my blood started to clot there, so likely that one of those thoughts would have gone up into my brain. But anyway, it didn't. And so, getting back to soft power. It's a long story. So, when I was writing an early draft, and I was going from the play to the musical, I just started writing about my stabbing. And I thought, this is never going to stay in the show. This is just something that I guess I need to do, I need to process it. And then it's actually now become a pretty central event in soft power because it is the engine through which the play becomes the musical. So David is, there's a DHH character like in Yellowface. So, David is in the play, the election happens, he gets stabbed, and then the whole musical, I think, he faints, and the whole musical is sort of a fever dream. The fever dream that happens when he's unconscious after he's been stabbed. And then he wakes up at the end, so there's sort of a Wizard of Oz-like structure. And my collaborators, Ginny Tesori, Emily Silverman, my director, Oscar Eustace, who runs public theater, as you know, and as our dramaturg, really encouraged me to look at my stabbing more seriously through this show. So, in some sense, soft power also then ends up becoming an investigation of why I got stabbed. And the stabbing becomes kind of a metaphor for America in 2016 and the sort of shock of that and the kind of fever dream that many of us feel we've been living in since 2016.
And that's soft power. And then if you wanted to see a definition of fever dream, there's a scene with Hillary Clinton riding around on a gigantic French fry at McDonald's. So it's a wonderful show.
Working on a cheese.